Good evening, everybody. You're all very welcome to this Irish Wildlife Trust webinar. My name is Pádraig Fogarty. I'm the campaign officer with the Irish Wildlife Trust. If this is your first Irish Wildlife Trust webinar, you're very welcome. If it isn't, you're very welcome back. I'd also say that we have been running these webinars now for a couple of years, and I think we've built up quite a collection of presentations, and you can go to our YouTube site and you can have a look back at some of the many videos and expert speakers we've had over the last couple of years on a really impressive range of topics. So do check that out. If you're not familiar with the Irish Wildlife Trust, we are a national non-governmental organisation. We've been around since the late 1970s, and our job is to raise awareness of wildlife and biodiversity, as we call it these days, and its importance to people. And we also campaign for nature and for biodiversity at a national and at a local level. Do bear in mind, we're a membership organization, so if you want to support our work, please do consider joining us. And if you do join us, you'll get this wonderful magazine. This is our summer issue, which is hot off the press, and we think it's Ireland's best wildlife magazine, and that only goes to our members. So please do consider joining up. This evening, we've got a fantastic topic, I think, to talk to you about. So just before I get stuck into that, just a little bit of housekeeping. As you may have noticed, we're recording this webinar. So if you do realize that you have friends that would like to have seen it, you can direct them to our YouTube channel. As I've mentioned, we put it online by the end of this week. You will see at the bottom there is a Q&A button. If you have questions for our guest speaker, or indeed myself, because unusually I'm going to be giving some of this presentation, please do put them into the Q&A button, and we will make time at the end of this webinar to have discussion and to get to those questions. So without further ado, tonight's topic of conversation is the sturgeon. And if you have never heard of a sturgeon, you don't know what a sturgeon is, that's perfectly all right. We're going to talk about this amazing fish from the beginning. And I think it's a wonderful thing to talk about. It's an amazing animal, and I think it's fantastic to see some of the efforts that are going on around Europe and indeed in the UK to restore it and to bring it back from the brink of extinction. So the way we're going to work this webinar this evening, the Irish Wildlife Trust has been involved with, partnered up with the Blue Marine Foundation, which is based in the UK. On this project that we have undertaken, and I'll talk a little bit about our involvement in it and the report that we produced, which discusses in particular the potential for reintroduction of sturgeon to Irish waters. But I'm very happy to say that Jenny Murray from the Blue Marine Foundation is also joining us this evening. And we thought it was, well, originally when we started talking about this, we thought this would be a great project because really, from the sturgeon's point of view, there is no Ireland and there is no UK. It's basically the same waters that are swimming in throughout Western Europe. So we thought this would be a really nice project for us to collaborate on. And also, by perhaps not by coincidence, but the various NGOs in the UK have been working on an action plan for the reintroduction of sturgeon, and Jenny is going to tell us a little bit about that. So I will stop talking now and I'll hand you over to Jenny. Jenny is the Senior Restoration Projects Manager with Blue Marine Foundation, as I have just said, and she works on fisheries policy, marine protected areas, and marine management, and sturgeon, it would seem. So over to you, Jenny, in your own time, if you'd like to share your screen, please.
Thanks, Pádraig. Hi, everyone. I'll just hopefully you can see this in a second. Did that work?
Yeah, seeing that perfectly.
Great. So thank you so much for inviting me to talk today about sturgeon and the efforts to ongoing to recover them in the UK and Europe. So in this presentation, I'm just going to talk about European and Atlantic sturgeon, their conservation history, threats, and what the UK Sturgeon Alliance is doing to restore them. But for anyone who isn't aware of the Blue Marine Foundation, we are a marine and fisheries conservation charity that works globally to see at least 30% of the world's oceans under effective protection by 2030, and the other 70% managed in a responsible way. And we work across 5 key interventions. So we work to secure marine protected areas, we develop models of sustainable fishing, we restore marine life and tackle unsustainable fishing, and also connect people with the sea. So sturgeon are one of the oldest fish families still living on Earth. They date back to around 200 million years ago. There are 27 different species of sturgeon worldwide, and 8 of these are native to Europe. 2 are native to UK waters, so that's the European sturgeon and the Atlantic sturgeon, or it's sometimes referred to as the Baltic sturgeon, and those are the ones I'm going to focus on in the presentation today. So historically, European sturgeon was one of the most widespread of sturgeon species, and it occurred in all coastal waters and main river systems of Northwest Europe, including UK waters, but today it's one of the most threatened fish species in the world, and it's assessed as critically endangered on the IUCN's Red List of threatened species. So this first map here just shows you the past and present distribution of European sturgeon freshwater habitat, and you can see that the Gironde, which is the dark blue line here on the west coast of France, is the only remaining freshwater habitat where there is a natural population of European sturgeon. But as far as we're aware, spawning hasn't occurred there since 1994. On the right is Atlantic sturgeon, and that's widely distributed along the east coast of North America. But in Europe, it was originally only considered to be confined to the Baltic Sea and its tributaries. So, but that's now actually being challenged. Archaeological work has demonstrated that the Atlantic sturgeon have also lived alongside European sturgeon on the Atlantic coast of Europe for the past at least 2,000 years. But like the European sturgeon, they've also declined and are considered vulnerable globally. So both species of sturgeon are migratory, so they move into freshwater habitats to spawn. Young sturgeon will spend around 1 to 3 years in freshwater habitats. That's dependent on the species. And after what time they'll start to migrate into coastal and marine waters to feed, primarily on the seabed on things like worms and crustaceans. So sturgeon take quite a long time to mature, between 10 and 27 years, depending on species, sex, and other environmental parameters. And they can grow to over 5 meters in length and live to over 100 years, which is really, really impressive. So they also show a strong homing behavior. So mature sturgeon will return to their natal rivers to spawn, and they can lay around, well, between 500,000 and 2.5 million eggs at any one time. Some sturgeon are known to move to other estuaries in search of food, so that suggests there's some degree of straying that can occur. And these characteristics really make the species particularly susceptible to human pressures. So they are a really important indicator for good ecological status in rivers, estuaries, and marine waters. And so the protection of sturgeon really does need a holistic approach, connecting international waters, coastal areas, and their rivers and river systems, because they use all of these habitats throughout their life cycle. So why did they decline? Well, historically, since the Bronze Age, sturgeon were targeted for consumption, but they also suffered decline from other factors like overexploitation, habitat degradation, and the installation of riverways, which blocked their spawning grounds. So they're unable to migrate upstream. Pollution has also been identified as a factor affecting populations, particularly through their reproductive success through direct exposure to pollution, but also as a result of excessive nutrient release in freshwater habitats that can also impact on their spawning and feeding grounds. So the species are now heavily protected under international and European legislation, as well as national legislation in most countries of this historic range, which you can see on these two maps here, tables here. So there are many efforts ongoing to try and recover the species across Europe, as Porrick mentioned, and I'll come on to that shortly. But in terms of the UK, our engagement really started in sturgeon conservation in 2006, when a colleague of ours, Steve Colclough, who works for the Institute of Fisheries Management, attended a meeting for the Berne Convention, which is conservation of European wildlife and natural habitats, on behalf of the UK to discuss sturgeon decline. Following that meeting, Steve began to develop a database for past sturgeon records from UK waters using newspaper archives and museum records. And initially, he identified around 135 records from between around 1850s to 1993. But since then, Steve has been building that database, and it's expanded hugely now to over, we now have over 1,400 records in British rivers and more than 3,600 records from our coastal waters. Steve's also been liaising with Irish colleagues to compare his data set with the Irish database, which I'm sure Porrick will come on to in his talk later. But this map just shows Steve's database, which is now digitalizing, and you can see the large spread of sturgeon records across the UK. This map only has around 800 records on it so far, and the evidence was presented in this report to various regulators to really demonstrate that sturgeon are native to British waters. As I previously mentioned, there are many efforts ongoing to recover the species across Europe, but I'm really going to focus on France and German authorities who collaborated to develop an action plan for European sturgeon under the Berne Convention in 2007. So following this, they set up an artificial breeding program, and they released juveniles into the Gironde estuary in France. So there's been approximately 1.6 million juveniles that have been released into the Gironde region to date. In 2009, German authorities then began to stock juveniles into River Elbe, and in 2012, the Dutch authorities conducted a pilot stocking project in the Lower Rhine, as well as from the same French stock that was originally used for the Gironde. German authorities have also worked with various other Baltic states on a parallel restoration process for the Atlantic sturgeon since 2000, and more than 4.5 million Atlantic sturgeon have also been released into the Baltic Sea to date. Restocking was paused in 2015, and that was to observe natural recruitment. And in April 2021, they actually saw the first returning sturgeons beginning to appear back in the Gironde, which is really exciting. So they'll monitor to see whether they're successful in spawning. In the UK, there are currently no records of spawning populations of either sturgeon species in UK rivers, but there is evidence of intent to spawn. So we've had records of fish being caught with eggs and heavy weight, and during the time of the breeding period and stuff. So, but from the data we have available, the majority of the records for the UK have been observed through fisheries bycatch data. So we have around 15 recorded sightings of sturgeon in English waters since 1994, which we call our modern records because the last known natural spawning occurred in 1994. And most of them have come from the southwest coast. Interestingly, the historic database indicates that the south coast was also an important ground for sturgeon in English waters, suggesting that modern migrants are occupying some of the same marine feeding areas as their predecessors did. But it is important to note that because these records have come from fisheries catch data, it still remains unknown if sturgeon are present in more isolated areas or areas that are not regularly fished. Also, with the reintroduction efforts that are occurring in Europe that I mentioned, we believe that some of these records have come from the restocking programs are straying to our waters. So again, that really does just highlight the importance of a holistic approach that's needed across Europe for sturgeon to be able to recover. I should also say as well that that record on the River Wye there that you can see shouldn't be on there. We actually reassessed to see whether that should be present, because of we go through our records to see whether there's enough evidence to suggest whether it is a native species or not, and we didn't have enough evidence, so apologies, that shouldn't actually be on there. But so to coordinate all of the sturgeon restoration efforts, a group of environmental NGOs formed the UK Sturgeon Alliance in 2020, and that was to champion sturgeon conservation in the UK. And our vision is to restore populations of both native species of sturgeon as a flagship for healthy marine, estuarine and coastal systems. Here are the members of the Alliance to date, but it's increasingly expanding as well. So as a result of all the work and engagement done since 2006, there's been increased interest amongst governments and regulators, and together with these representatives, as well as experts and European experts, other interested NGOs, the Alliance have developed this 10-year action plan, which we recently launched in May this year. And that sits in conjunction with the Pan-European Action Plan that I mentioned previously. So this action plan was developed at a workshop led by ZSL on behalf of the UK Sturgeon Alliance in October 2022. During that workshop, the threats, the goals and the actions were identified, and these were then finalised and reviewed during a consultation process before submission of the final report. So the action plan is now available to access online. It includes background information on the species, the UK Alliance, and information on the Pan-European action plans that I've mentioned already. The threats identified during the workshop have been categorised into low, medium and high risk levels within the report. These have been broken down in more detail in the plan itself, but just to give you an overview, during that workshop, we identified the biggest threats being those highlighted in red here. So this includes residential and commercial development. So that's things like habitat modifications like hydropower stations and dredging and trawling activities, biological resource use. So that includes things like unintentional bycatch from fisheries, and also natural system modifications. So those river barriers that I talked about that can cut off spawning grounds. So these are kind of the highest risks to sturgeon recovering that we assessed during those workshops. So the plan sets out 5 goals, and within each of those goals, a series of objectives and actions have been set based around some of those risks that we talked about. So the first goal outlined in the plan is to ensure essential sturgeon habitat is protected and restored. So actions include things like we need to map data, a lot of data mapping work needs to be done to identify where those priority habitats are for sturgeon in terms of feeding and breeding grounds as well. And that will allow us to identify those risks to sturgeon and collaboratively work to mitigate them to help protect their habitats that are vital to them. The second goal focuses on establishing UK sturgeon populations. So we're not doing reintroductions at the moment, but through this process, we will need to carry out a structured decision-making process to explore the feasibility of reintroductions, what the advantages are, any potential disadvantages of storing sturgeon through reintroduction, and that process will really just ensure that if we do go down that route, any reintroductions are evidence-based and they consider potential impacts on stakeholders and also impacts on the river and coastal ecosystems as well. So I've mentioned previously that sturgeon are protected under various bits of legislation. So there are strict regulations that mean it's an offence to deliberately capture, kill or injure sturgeon, as well as disturb their breeding grounds. So third goal really just focuses on working with the commercial and recreational fishing industries to reduce bycatch mortality and also improve the guidance on reporting captures. There's some guidance in English waters, but not so much in other areas across the UK. So we really want to try and support the industries to submit those reports, those captures. The fourth goal will focus on carrying out stakeholder engagement to raise awareness of the species. Not many people have heard of sturgeon, and we really, building, raising awareness will help to ensure that those protections are enforced, and also, better support for sturgeon recovery. And then the final goal focuses on further research to close evidence gaps. So, we also talked about pressures like non-native species that are present in our waters as a result of pet trades. So, for example, sturgeon can be bought just offline as a pet species, but then people don't realise how big they get, or they're misidentified. The species are misidentified, so they grow quite large and they get released into river systems, and that causes pressure on the native species. So there's not much research done around those impacts. So furthering that research, as well as other things, will really help us to understand and progress sturgeon conservation in the UK. So ultimately, we really hope that these goals and actions combined will help to contribute to the European-wide efforts of restoring sturgeon species. And in terms of next steps, the Alliance, so as we only just published this in May, a new thing, but we're working with the Alliance as well as others involved in delivering those actions beginning this year. And through that process, we categorized, or we prioritized each of the actions based on their priority. So whether we be delivering them on the short term within 1 to 2 years, or whether we are trying to address them within the medium term, 3 to 5 years, or 5 years and beyond, which is a longer term thing. So we're going to start that process now, really. And then the final thing I just wanted to say was, last year Blue launched the Save the Sturgeon website. So it's a really great place to learn more about sturgeon, and really encourage you to have a look at it. We're encouraging the general public to use this site to submit any sturgeon sightings, whether that's past or present, that you're aware of through fishing industries or through angling, or if you know friends have caught these. It really helps us to build the database of sturgeon records across the UK, and that will help us deliver the action plan more widely. And so have a look at that website. We've had a lot of records come through this so far, which is really great, including non-native records, which is also really useful for us to be aware of. So that was everything. So I'll hand back to Porrick. Thanks very much. I'll stop sharing my screen as well.
Yeah, thanks very much for that, Jenny. So I'm going to share my screen. There we go. You might confirm, Jenny, is that you're seeing that, are you?
Yes, I can see that. Yep.
Very good. Okay, I'll fire on. So thanks very much, Jenny. That was really fascinating. And I have to say, I mean, we started this project started, as a conversation between ourselves and Blue Marine Foundation. And I mean, I by no means am an expert in sturgeon. But I've learned an awful lot about them through my conversations with Jenny and the other Blue Marine people. But my interest in sturgeon goes back a little bit, because I wrote a book maybe 6 years ago about Ireland's vanishing nature, and one of the things I looked at was the species that has gone extinct from Ireland. And the sturgeon, I thought, was really fascinating because of the stories behind it, and because it's such an amazing looking fish as well. I mean, there's really nothing else that looks like it. But just to put it into context, I mean, I think I first became aware of sturgeon, as the fish that gave us caviar. And these are these enormous fish that live in the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea, and their roe or their eggs sell for eye-watering sums. You can sometimes see them in the departure lounges of airports and stuff like that. But these are the species of sturgeon that live in European waters. and the beluga one is famous for the caviar, but the sturgeon that are found in our waters are not utilized for caviar, but they're all of them are threatened with extinction to one degree or another, which is pretty catastrophic for the species, because, as Jenny pointed out, they tend to be slow growing. They tend to mature at a rather late age, and they grow to this immense size. And this is a picture I just got off the internet. I mean, this is from, probably Russia or one of the Caspian countries, and I mean they're absolute monsters. Now our sturgeon don't grow to this size that we know of, but it does give you a kind of a hint as to the impressive size that they grow to. Here's another one that I got off the internet. And of course, fishermen do this. Of course, they shove the fish into the camera to make it look bigger. But still in all, it's a very impressive sized fish. And particularly in this photograph, you really see, what makes the sturgeon unmistakable. That kind of snooty looking snout on it, and the mustache type barbels is what they're called. These kind of hairy appendages at the end of their nose that they use for finding their way around the muddy waters and detecting their prey. So absolutely fascinating creatures, and a fascinating life story. Now, you've seen this already. Jenny showed you a version of this, and this is the distribution of the European sturgeon. And actually, it's the former distribution of the European sturgeon. The little beige browny color you see there in the south of France is the remaining habitat where they have been recorded breeding, I think in the early 1990s. But pretty much around that time, sturgeon disappeared from many parts of Europe, and you can see just the absolute massive scale of the contraction in their range over that time. These are fish that have been known as dinosaur fish because they swam in our waters during the Jurassic period, and yet they haven't been able to survive the Anthropocene so well. Like so many other species, they've been absolutely hammered by human activity over the centuries, but particularly so in the last couple of decades. It's possibly more remarkable that they haven't gone extinct completely. I mean, that does give you an idea of the resilience of life in many ways, that extinction is even quite a hard thing to achieve, but it is quite impressive that they have managed to hold on at all. But that goes to show. Now, what really triggered my interest in the sturgeon was visits to the Natural History Museum in Dublin. And if you haven't been and you're near Dublin, I'd absolutely recommend a visit. We call it the Dead Zoo, and it's apart from it being, one of these amazing Victorian era cabinet case style museums, it has an awful lot to tell us about biodiversity today. And one of the most interesting parts of it that I find is on the ground floor when you go to the back of the hall with all the Irish animals in it, behind the enormous skeletons of the Irish elk. You'll find the fish. And it's absolutely incredible because it has cases full of fish that we're familiar with today, but we have never seen fish the size of them. Mackerel, maybe 1.5 meters long, or plaice the size of enormous dinner trays. And there's a common skate that isn't so common anymore, the size of a car bonnet. And it shows you the size of the fish that were in our seas 100 years ago. And one of these, of course, is the sturgeon. And this particular sturgeon was taken from the River Liffey in 1898, and the museum card on it tells you that it was taken from the Poolbeg salmon fishery. So Poolbeg, for those of you who don't know, is now near Ringsend. It's kind of on the outer margins of Dublin City, near the bay, near kind of Irish Town. And it tells you that there was an active fishing industry going on in Poolbeg 100 years ago, and there was a salmon fishery even going on at the time. And within that fishery, they caught this enormous sturgeon, which is about 2 meters in length. And again, you see the barbels, and you see this kind of frankly weird mouth that it has, like some kind of a suction cup that it goes around eating crabs and crustaceans or whatever it can find on the bed of estuaries and the sea where it lives most of its life. Now, this museum card, I took this photograph in the museum for the book that I wrote, and by coincidence, I'm kind of glad I took it, because you see on the museum card it says it's a Accipenser sturio, which is the European sturgeon. But very interestingly, in 2016, there was a DNA analysis done on this fish, and the results of that showed that it wasn't, in fact, a European sturgeon, but it was an Atlantic sturgeon. And so this brings us back to the slide that Jenny showed you of the two different types of sturgeon that are found in our waters. And I suppose it throws a little bit of confusion, I think, about what the sturgeon wear, what species of sturgeon they wear around our waters. Anyway, this is just maybe another interesting dimension to it. That this DNA analysis found that, in fact, the museum need to change their display card. And thanks to the work of Declan Quigley. Declan used to work for the Sea Fisheries Protection Authority, and in his own time, he has gathered all of the records of sturgeon from Ireland since the early 1700s, and it's quite fascinating. I mean, the presence of sturgeon in Ireland goes back to the Middle Ages. We know, for instance, that the monks at Clonmacnoise, which is well up the River Shannon, were eating sturgeon. If you visit Clonmacnoise today, you'll see a panel about what the monks were eating. And of course, salmon and, deer and so on, but also sturgeon. Now, we don't know if that meant that the sturgeon were actually living that far up the Shannon, or whether they were, being brought up there by people further downstream. But it is an interesting record all the same. And Declan has gathered these other records from around the coast. And I guess the history of sturgeon is notable because it wasn't treated like any other fish. They don't gather in great big shoals like herring and mackerel do. They were always a very notable fish. And even before English rule in Ireland, sturgeon were noted to have been given as peace offerings between warring clans. When the English did colonize Ireland, the sturgeon became what was referred to as a royal fish, which meant that it was automatically the property of the British king or the Queen in later years. And alongside beached whales were also royal fish, and so the presence of sturgeon were always noteworthy, not only because of their size and their distinctive shape, but because they had this very particular value to them. And maybe that helps us in terms of being able to track their presence in our waters over the years. In any case, Declan has shown, you can see around the coast, that sturgeon were pretty much found everywhere around our coast. As Jenny noted, they live most of their lives in the sea, and they come into the rivers to spawn. Now, we don't know whether, we can't be 100% sure that sturgeon were ever spawning in Irish waters, but you can see that there were records of them in fresh water. And Declan has also noted records of sturgeon that were, female sturgeon that were laden with roe in fresh water. I think that was in the River Lee. and also records of fish in the kind of freshwater portions of river at the time where you would expect female fish to be coming into the river to spawn. So this is circumstantial evidence that they were spawning in our rivers. And as you can see from the records there, these are the main rivers in Ireland that maybe you would expect them to be found in. Now, drawing on that work, we're very lucky because a couple of years ago, an MSc student, Melissa van der Hayden, was studying in Galway Mayo Institute of Technology, which is now called the Atlantic Technological University. And she did her MSc on sturgeon and on the suitability of habitat in Ireland for sturgeon. And she looked at a number of those big rivers where there had been records of them before. You can see them all there. And she looked at the various factors that we believe would have been relevant to good sturgeon habitat, in particular water quality, but very importantly, the barriers to fish on these rivers. So as we've mentioned before, sturgeon migrate into freshwater rivers to spawn. And of course, if there are dams and weirs and other blockages, that automatically cuts off huge portions of their habitat. And while this feature of dams and weirs has been known for a long time, much of the work to alleviate them or to compensate for that imposition has really been to the benefit of salmon. And but we know that salmon are capable of jumping over barriers to a certain degree, but many of our migratory fish are not able to jump. So eels, for instance, lampreys, and the sturgeon. And so even perhaps quite minor barriers could be a big barrier to a sturgeon. In any case, we know also that these rivers have hundreds, if not thousands, of barriers on them. We started putting barriers on our rivers, hundreds of years ago to channel energy for mills and so on. And during the 20th century, we really went, gangbusters trying to dam rivers. And most of our rivers have very significant barriers on them, such as the Ardnacrusha Dam on the Shannon, or on the Erne, or the Liffey and the Lee, and so on. Anyway, Melissa looked at all of these, and she found that in all of the analyzed rivers, medium to highly suitable spawning and rearing habitat is found, which, according to a subsequent population viability analysis, would be sufficient to sustain a viable population of European sturgeon. So this is really encouraging news. So she actually thought that the River Shannon had the most available habitat at the moment for European sturgeon. Now, there is one caveat to that. Melissa, in her work, didn't look at the substrate, so that is the quality of the river bottom. And we know that is probably an important factor. We know, for instance, that salmon need very clean gravel on which to lay their eggs, and it may well be the case that sturgeon is the same. So we do need additional data to be more conclusive, maybe, about that availability of suitable habitat now. But she also concluded that removing certain barriers, particularly in the lower stretches of these rivers, would open up significantly more habitat for the sturgeon. And this is obviously a very interesting conclusion, because removing barriers on rivers is something that is needed anyway for the restoration of river habitat. So that in itself is fascinating and very encouraging research to have to hand. Now, one of the things we wanted to find out as part of our study into the sturgeon was about the legal status of the fish in Irish waters. So at the moment, the sturgeon is not officially extinct. from Ireland. The way that these analyses are done are through what are known as red lists, and these are done in accordance with international methodologies from the International Union of the Conservation of Nature. And we have red lists for all kinds of groups of species, from mammals and butterflies and so on. And Ireland's red list of freshwater fish was first published over a decade ago. And it concluded that the sturgeon was a vagrant. It wasn't really ever resident in Irish waters, and therefore it wasn't assessed. So the sturgeon is not officially extinct from Ireland. Now, I think from the evidence that I showed you on this slide and the work of Declan Quigley, that probably is not correct, that we do need to reevaluate that status. But then I suppose the next question is whether we're talking about sturgeon in a marine environment or whether we're talking about breeding sturgeon in the freshwater environment. And I suppose it is important that we are science-based and that we're clear about what we're talking about. The other thing, of course, that we're now also wondering is that what species of sturgeon are we referring to if we say that the sturgeon is extinct? Is it the European sturgeon or is it the Atlantic sturgeon? In any case, we recruited a marine lawyer, Dr. Sarah Ryan Enright, to look at this question for us. Is the sturgeon a protected species in Ireland? And is there a requirement or an onus on the Irish government to reintroduce sturgeon? These are the questions that we wanted answered. And so the answer to that is yes, the sturgeon is protected. The sturgeon is listed under Annex 2 of the European Union Habitats Directive, which Ireland has signed up to. That requires that member states create special areas of conservation for the protection of sturgeon. Now, because there are no resident populations of sturgeon in Ireland that we know of, that would mean that really we can't create a special area of conservation without that information. But it does mean that also under one of the other annexes of the Habitats Directive, the sturgeon is basically protected everywhere. So not just in special areas of conservation that the sturgeon is strictly protected. And so this means if a sturgeon were to wander into our waters, it is a protected species. If it were to naturally become a breeding species in Ireland, well, then there is an onus on the Irish government to protect it. Now, we also wanted to know, was there an onus on the government to reintroduce them? And the answer to that is no. There is a stipulation in the Habitats Directive that requires signatory states to examine the feasibility of reintroducing species that are listed in the various annexes. So that much is clear. The government does have a responsibility to examine the feasibility of reintroducing the species. Now, Ireland has also signed up to a range of other conventions at the international level, from the Bonn Convention and the Berne Convention, right up to the Convention on Biological Diversity. And all of these various conventions refer to reintroduction of missing species or participating in efforts for conservation of these species at a wider European level. So there's certainly that, but none of those conventions have any actually legal backing. So there's certainly a moral responsibility, and certainly if the government is serious when it signs up to these conventions, there is a responsibility, in our view, on the government to take seriously the issue of sturgeon reintroduction, but also reintroduction of lots of other plants and animals and species that we know are extinct from Ireland. So that much is clear. So on foot of that, we published our report last month called Restoring the Sturgeon to Irish Waters. And we published it more or less to coincide with the publication of the UK Sturgeon Conservation Strategy and Action Plan as well, because really this would be part of a joint effort across Europe, not just with the UK, but with partners in France and Germany and Holland and other countries where sturgeon reintroduction efforts are underway. And so we had 7 particular demands that we proposed coming out of our report. And one of them is for the government to do this formal analysis into the feasibility of reintroducing sturgeon. So in other words, to take the research that we have done and that Declan Quigley has done and Melissa van der Heyden have done, and to formalize that into a proper position from the Irish government on what we intend to do about sturgeon, and what species are we talking about? Are we talking about the Atlantic or the European, or are we talking about both, or what is the approach that we want to take? As part of that, we also want a review of the red list. We want to see sturgeon recognized as being a resident species in Irish waters, and we feel that this may sound like a kind of a technocratic move to get them listed as being extinct. But if we don't recognize them as being extinct, well then, we know that the authorities won't feel under any pressure to do anything about it. So at least if they are officially acknowledged as being extinct, then we do have, I guess, a stick to try and lever various government agencies to do something about it. And we see this being important in other areas. For instance, if you look at the red list for mammals in Ireland, you'll find that all of the species listed are in favourable conservation status. There's no mammal in Ireland that is threatened with extinction, which sounds, very hopeful, except that about 1/5 of the native mammals in Ireland are already extinct. And most of those species are not even acknowledged to be extinct, like bears and wildcats and so on. Only the wolf is acknowledged to be extinct. So this may sound bureaucratic, but we feel that it is important. Number 3, we know that sturgeon, if they were reintroduced, they would still be susceptible to the pressures that probably drove them extinct in the first place. And among these would be bottom trawling and fishing pressures. So we want the government to get on with establishing marine protected areas and making sure that these marine protected areas are actually protected, that they're not just lines on maps, which would mean removing bottom trawling and industrial fishing from these areas. And that is something the government has said it will do anyway, and that would help sturgeon were they to be reintroduced. The European Union has also asked of member states under their action plan for fisheries that by next year, by March, actually, we come up with a plan to remove bottom trawling from existing special areas of conservation in the marine environment. So that's a really important thing that would accelerate the process, because we don't even have legislation at the moment for marine protected areas. We also know that there are other pieces of legislation, such as the Water Framework Directive, which legally mandates improving the status of our water bodies to get them into good status. And that's about water quality, improving water quality, but it's also about improving the what's called the hydromorphology of rivers. In other words, whether they whether there's connectivity laterally and longitudinally, in other words, removing barriers on rivers. So this is something we've also signed up to. Next, and this is very current, this is in relation to the nature restoration law, which is happening at a European level. We need a strong and ambitious nature restoration law. If that's currently a proposal at the moment, if that becomes law, it will mandate legally for the restoration of species that are listed for protection in the Habitats Directive, including the sturgeon. So that would mean that we would have to, within our national restoration plan, we would have to come up with a plan for the restoration of sturgeon in Irish waters. We also want to see this work go beyond just sturgeon. We know that there's at least 100 species of plant and animal that have gone extinct from Ireland over the years due to human activity. And we have no particular coordinated efforts to look at those reintroductions. We have reintroduced species such as golden eagles and white-tailed eagles. We are going to be reintroducing osprey, which is also a bird of prey, this summer, and that's very exciting. But we're going too slowly and we're being too timid. So we need to see a much more coordinated effort to examining which species should be prioritized for reintroduction, and basically get a unit within the National Parks and Wildlife Service that is dedicated to reintroductions across the island, because this is part of the process of re-establishing native ecosystems, which is so important for addressing the climate and biodiversity guidance crisis. And just on our last point, then we want to see published guidelines from the state on how to do this, because at the moment it's very difficult to even know what you need to do to reintroduce a species, and we think that if it was clearer and if it was easy, we could see community groups, local NGOs getting involved in reintroductions of species to their local area. We want to see that done properly. We want to see it done with a very firm base in science, but we also want it to be done in a comprehensive way. Now, some people might ask, why would you be bothered reintroducing the sturgeon when there's so many other things that need to be done? And we would feel that the sturgeon is what's called an umbrella species. So it could be, this totemic species that would really help us to restore our rivers, restore our marine environment, and to help get local communities involved in the restoration of their local ecosystem. So for that reason alone, it could be really important. Now, I want to leave time for questions, but I also want to highlight a surprise arrival in our waters only last week. And these pictures, I don't have the photographer. They were taken from Facebook, and I think they were on Facebook, and they were sent to me. And this is the sturgeon that turned up in the River Shore last week. And as you can see, it's an absolute whopper. Now, what can we tell from this? And the answer is not a whole lot. We know that Inland Fisheries Ireland are in possession of the fish, and that they are doing a DNA analysis on it to find out more about it. There's presumably a lot we can learn from the body of this fish. But they did release a statement today on Twitter saying that they believed that it was probably a non-native hybrid fish and is not a European sturgeon. So is probably not a native fish. So that kind of raises other questions then, and maybe Jenny pointed to it, how people can buy these fish basically online. They can rear them in tanks at home, and maybe when they get too big, they're being dumped back into the river or the sea. But to be honest, we really don't know the answer to any of these questions. So we do look forward to hearing more from Inland Fisheries Ireland when these studies are completed. So that is all from me, and I'm going to stop sharing now. And Jenny, I'll ask you to turn on your video again. Thank you. And I am going to go to our questions now. And if you do have a question in the 10 minutes or so we have left, please put it into the Q&A button, and I will try and get to them. So my first question here is from Andrew. And he asks, this question is based on one of your slides there, Jenny. He says, why is the sturgeon basically not extinct in the North Sea, but possibly extinct in the Irish Sea? I mean, can you maybe talk to us about why there is this doubt over the rivers that it spawned in, or whether it's extinct or not extinct? Because as I understand it, the sturgeon is not officially extinct in the UK either.
Can you hear me? Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Great.
Go ahead.
Yeah, so I mean, interestingly, over the last, with the data records that Steve Holcroft has been building, we, started off with very little records, and now that there's quite a few, well, we have over 3,000 records, over 1,400 in UK rivers. Really, that's, that data was presented to the regulators following that process. So I think before that time, there just wasn't enough data available to determine whether that species was extinct in that area or not. So recently, the UK has just undergone it's undergone a red list assessment, or being assessed to see whether it would go into that for Great British freshwater species. But it was decided that there just wasn't enough evidence to undergo that assessment because of the spawning stuff. So we don't actually, whilst there's intent to spawn, whilst we have evidence of intent to spawn, as I mentioned, through things like fish species coming in to the rivers at certain times of the year, so generally around the breeding season, large females captured with eggs. There's no actual evidence to suggest that they ever spawned in that area, so that could indicate smaller species. There was a small species, I think 23 centimeters, recorded in one of the rivers in the UK, but there just wasn't enough evidence for that assessment to go through to determine whether it was or not. But the UK regulators have actually now decided that there is enough evidence based on all of Steve's data that it's native to UK waters. So it's probably something similar in that sense, in terms of there just wasn't enough data available to go through that assessment, and it probably needs a review of that assessment based on the data that's now been collected. Yeah, does that answer your question?
Yeah. And what is your sense, as I understand it, this issue with the Atlantic sturgeon? I mean, until quite recently, the Atlantic sturgeon wasn't believed to be on this side of the Atlantic at all. And now that view has changed. I mean, if you were to reintroduce sturgeon, which one would you be reintroducing?
Yeah, good question. So there's still a lot of work to be done around that. There still needs to be a re-review of the data that we've got currently to look at some of the records to see whether they are actually European or Atlantic. So I think part of that process, before we even decide, whether reintroduction should be happening, we should also be trying to better understand which species we're actually looking at and where, because it could be very specific to different river systems as well. For example, on the west coast, I never remember which way around it is, but something like either on the western rivers, in English waters, it's more predominantly European sturgeon, whereas in the east it's Atlantic, or the other way around. So there just needs to be a further assessment of that. So we don't actually know yet which of those species we would reintroduce where, but it is interesting to see that the records we've got so far have been a mixture of both, and also historic records as well through museum and genetic analysis to show that both were present and are living alongside each other.
And on the question of the spawning, I mean, most of our records of sturgeon in Ireland and Britain are so old that, I mean, we're never going to know for sure. But I mean, at some point, we have to make an educated guess, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, or what is the level of evidence that will be required, do you think, to decide whether this should be a spawning river or not?
Yeah, it's a really good point, because we've kind of gone through that process, as I mentioned, with some of the regulators in the UK, and Steve's collected a lot of data on some of the records and tried to justify that through the reports that I mentioned. So yeah, as I said, sturgeon coming into rivers at certain times of the year, but it's really difficult to answer because I don't know the criteria that the regulators have used to decide whether that's enough evidence to suggest they spawned in the area. I think if there's more records to show that there's smaller sturgeon records in the area, because they'd be too small to migrate from other areas. So like through reintroductions, that if they're quite small species under 50 centimeters, it's still too small for them to migrate. So that suggests that they would have been born in UK rivers. So I think it's a case of building on the database and looking at other records, and if more of those come out, then that's something that we would add to justify that even further. But at the moment, the only things we've got really is size of fish that are coming in, the times of years they're coming in, and also how much they weigh, and that they've been seen with eggs. But yeah, we haven't had evidence of those smaller fish in our rivers.
Mm-hmm. Can I ask you as well, because you pointed out they're releasing millions of these fish in France and Holland. Is it on the Rhine as well? They're releasing.
Yeah, so there's lots of different programs. So France, Germany, France are doing European sturgeon, Germany also that, and Atlantic sturgeon, as well as loads of other Baltic states are now starting to look at feasibility, and some are carrying those out now. So it's a big European effort to do that.
So is it a case, I mean, if we clean up our rivers and remove these barriers, that there's a chance that some of these fish will naturally find their way into our rivers? Is there an argument to say, hold on, we should just let them find their own way, or is there a particular case for helping that along?
Yeah, I think so. In terms of whether they'll find their own way there, yes, and that's what we're starting to see with the European introductions in especially along the southwest coast. Some of the records that we've got, we think around 20 of our records since the 1990s have come from reintroduction programs. So some of them are tagged, some have done through genetic analysis. Some of that we can tell by just the size of the fish and the year that it was caught, and the likelihood of it coming from and the time it was reintroduced. So because straying occurs naturally, I think around 5 to 10% of sturgeon will stray to other areas. Most of them will go back to their natal rivers to spawn, but some of them will stray. So we're already starting to see that. So I think the case is needed for not just reintroductions, but also making sure that the rivers are in a good state to ensure that they can survive and spawn here. In terms of whether that's enough, I don't think we really know yet, because the populations are still quite small. Whether they're enough to become self-sustaining, potentially unlikely, but there still needs to be a big process to go through, a decision-making process to determine whether reintroduction is the right approach based on other factors like impacts to other stakeholders, whether it's going to impact on existing ecosystems. We have a lot of marine designations in place, and that's everything we need to consider as well. So it's definitely something that we're looking into in terms of the feasibility of it. But
it is a fascinating discussion. I saw in Britain earlier this week there was a guerrilla rewilding of a butterfly. I can't remember the name of the butterfly, but basically it sparked this debate about that if you're a conservationist and you want to introduce something, you have to really get over a very high bar of evidence, and yet all kinds of other things are released into the countryside every day of the week, whether it's from garden centres or pet shops, and there's very little concern about that, it would seem. A different set of rules if you're doing it for conservation purposes, which I agree that we have to be scientific in our approach, but I also feel that it shouldn't be so difficult given the absolute crisis we're facing at the moment. Janine is asking, if you did get the Irish government to agree that sturgeon is extinct, do you think they would cover protection of the sturgeon in fresh and coastal waters, or would they separate the two? This is actually a very interesting question, because the Atlantic salmon is listed in the Habitats Directive, just like the sturgeon. And we have created special areas of conservation for Atlantic salmon in Ireland, but only in fresh water. And we are told, but once they get out of the sea, they're not protected anymore. And this obviously doesn't make any sense, really, does it? I mean, because the salmon, like the sturgeon, spends most of its life out at sea, and if you're not protecting them at sea, you're really not protecting the species. So I think it would be really important that it is protected throughout its life cycle. If we get this nature restoration law over the line, well, then I think that would help to to cover that. But also the sturgeon is strictly protected in the Habitats Directive, which means actually de facto already it is protected wherever it is found. Fred is asking if the fish found recently was raised in a fish tank and released into a river, could we look at encouraging citizens to raise the desired species and stock local rivers with strong fish? I mean, I think yes. This is what I'm getting at about community involvement. I think it'd be wonderful. We do want to make sure it's done properly. We want to make sure that it's done, with the best chance of conservation success. And this is, again, I guess I'm getting at the point here that we really have different sets of rules at the moment, and there's no control over what's being released in the countryside. But definitely, I think community involvement and getting people participating in these things would be amazing. We have another question here. What is the next step in getting the Irish government to respond to this? Well, I mean, the Irish government isn't exactly, chomping at the bit to do these things, although they surprised us this year with an announcement that they're reintroducing osprey, and that's very exciting. Of course, the osprey was originally a project of the Golden Eagle Trust, so maybe there's hope in that for us, in that NGOs do have a role in highlighting these things, and then maybe the government will take the next step. But I don't know. I would like to think that they would consider our proposal seriously. I think there is I have found out that the red list is being revised, and but we don't know. Again, sometimes these procedures can be hermetically sealed, and but certainly we are trying to find a way into that process and contribute the available research to get a reevaluation of the sturgeon, so that it is recognized as a native species, and I think that would be important. But maybe just to finish up, because I know it's getting late now, I'll ask that question of you as well, Jenny. I mean, what are the next steps for you guys in Blue Marine Foundation and the Sturgeon Alliance?
So we're really working now to just progress on with the action plan. We've categorized, as I mentioned in the talk, some of the goals and actions based on the priorities of when they need doing. So within the first couple of years, we're really looking to build on the database that Steve has done, really assess what we're looking at in terms of Atlantic sturgeon, European sturgeon, where they are, where their priority habitats are. So we'll be doing a lot of work around data collection on habitat suitability, and we'll also be working hopefully with the fishing industry to really build engagement and work with them to continue for them. We've had good engagement with them for submitting records to us so far for some of them. So we really want to build on those relationships and continue that work, because as we get more data, and that's really going to help us with that work. And then there's also continued engagement with the regulators to raise awareness of sturgeon and all the efforts across Europe as well, because as we say, we're getting all these records across UK waters. We'll continue to build on that, and we're seeing species move from Europe to UK waters, and I think that just really demonstrates that holistic approach that's needed. So we'll continue that engagement as well. So yeah, it's really exciting to finally start working on it now that this has been launched, and we've got collaboration with lots of people. So yeah, hoping to continue that engagement.
Brilliant. Well, we wish you every success in your work. We'll obviously follow it closely, and we will piggyback on any of your successes and learn from your mistakes. and we certainly hope that we'll make progress on this. There are already so many demands to improve the status of our seas and our rivers that all of these things can only be good for sturgeon and all the other critters that live in our waters. So Jenny, thank you very much for that. And thank you very much, everybody at home, for tuning in to learn about the sturgeon. This is our last webinar of this series. I'm taking a break for the summer, and we'll be back in September with a new lineup for the new year. Always lots happening in the field of climate and biodiversity and environmental protection. And we hope to continue covering all of these really important topics. So do make sure to go onto our YouTube channel. Also, please do consider supporting the work of the Irish Wildlife Trust and joining our organization because that really is important to us. And it would be remiss of me to leave you without impressing on you the need for us to get this nature restoration law over the line at a European level. The coming weeks are going to be absolutely critical. We need every member of the European Parliament, that's our MEPs, to vote in favour of this. If you go onto our website, that's iwt.ie, we've made it very easy for people to fill out a form that will create an automated email that will go to all of Ireland's MEPs to demand that they support this critically important legislation. And the more people that do that, the more pressure they will be under, because we know many of them, too many of them, are completely opposed to all of these measures, which is outrageous and disgraceful, and we really need to be piling the pressure on them. But thank you again to Jenny. We really appreciate you taking the time to share your work and your research with us. It was absolutely fascinating. And thank you again to everyone at home, and we'll see you again next time. Good night, everybody.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks. Bye.